Hey folks, it's been a bit since I've dabbled in a deck builder, but today I'll be talking about Groundshatter stylish indie game, Fights in Tight Spaces. Though I won't just be talking about the vanilla experience, given I'd also picked up the Weapon of Choice DLC. In any case, it's time to ask, did I find this title to be a good fit, or was I quick to cry uncle and move on? I'm your host Arlian, let's find out together. Welcome to Section 11, a clandestine organization which wages a silent war against various groups which may pose a threat to the world. A war which you're spearheading as Agent 11. And that's about the sum of things really, since Fights in Tight Spaces is more concerned with throwing players into the thick of things than any sort of narrative nuance. That's not to say there aren't story segments, but they're more akin to scene setting. Very tongue-in-cheek scene setting, if the Berlin situation is anything to go by. At least until I got to the Weapon of Choice DLC. While it's still an overall story-light experience, the campaign possesses an overarching story told across each of the game's chapters. More importantly, it adds some suitably snarky mini-boss banter whenever you encounter the new assassin enemies. Though, I confess that it will always play out in the same order, so I wound up seeing those earlier exchanges quite a bit. Still, what I really want to talk about here is the gameplay, because well, Fights in Tight Spaces, hereafter dubbed Fits, yes, that was the intro pun, is a fairly interesting entry in the deck building genre, simply due to how things play out. And that's because it adds grid-based combat to the mix. With this addition, the game becomes a lot more tactical, as I frequently found myself needing to figure out how to optimally maneuver through the game's titular tight spaces in order to reach my intended targets with its largely melee-focused decks, all while avoiding or minimizing the amount of attacks being aimed at me. Or at least as best as I could, since Agent 11's movement is tied to the cards you draw from your deck. Now, while this may sound like a recipe for some rather literal dead hands, I do feel the need to mention that on lower difficulties, Fits ensures you'll draw some form of movement card every turn. Nonetheless, whether it's able to extricate you from your situation is another matter entirely. While most attacks can be diffused by stepping off of a tile threatened by an enemy, doing so when backed into a corner or surrounded can be difficult, and cards like Step or Dash just won't cut it since you can't move diagonally, normally. See, all of the best movement cards are extremely contextual, but properly using them will allow you to ignore the way movement normally functions. For instance, Slip and Shift provide additional movement options if you're adjacent to an enemy, allowing you to slide to their flank or even straight past them. There's also Swap, which lets you trade places with an enemy, but also sets them up to eat every attack that had been aimed your way. All of to say that the game manages to add a lot of tactical consideration to the act of moving, and your offensive options only compound this complexity. While some are simple, there's also a large number which make use of the game's grid, allowing you to really change up the odds. For instance, you can push enemies around to clear a path for yourself or direct their aim towards someone else. There's also the option of colliding them into a wall or an enemy for a small chunk of collision damage. Personally, though, my favorite option might be shoving enemies out of windows or off ledges for an instant KO. While these certainly require a degree of environmental awareness, they're extremely powerful. Though, if you really want to delve into the world of logistical nightmares, you can try picking up a grappler deck, because suplexing someone takes room. Simply put, as much as the game makes demands of its players and rapidly ramps up its lethality, it also provides a wide array of options for how to deal with all of its antagonists, such as your combo abilities. Now, combo is interesting because as opposed to your momentum, which serves as the basic currency to play your cards and which refills at the start of every round, combo primarily increases by attacking an enemy and decreases whenever you move, though a few cards mitigate this. Here's the thing though, making good use of these cards is important since they eschew momentum as a whole, allowing you to play more cards in a round so long as you hit the combo threshold needed to play them, which is made even better once you realize that doing so increases your combo further and pairs beautifully with cards that scale based on your current combo. That said, you do need to be careful because, well, there's quite a few cards which function as combo finishers, cards which expend all of your combo in exchange for chunky damage. Now in theory, this sounds like it could be pretty useful, but in practice I frequently found myself getting those cards out of my deck ASAP in favor of cards that scaled without spending, because once you've boosted your max combo enough, you can do some absolutely absurd damage fairly consistently. Which is a whole lot of words to say that there's a lot you need to learn and master. Doubly so if you want to avoid being resource starved, since beyond the cards you can draft for winning a fight, the bulk of what you can earn comes from completing the bonus objectives tied to each stage. And these can vary a bit, from combat-oriented goals like taking minimal damage or clearing a match within a certain turn count, to more movement-oriented objectives like snagging a briefcase of intel in a sparse number of turns. Some, like the Ambassador and Informant stages, also act as an exercise in mindfulness and positioning, with a dash of patience in the latter case, since informants like to throw hands even when you're trying not to kill them. That said, if you rise to the challenge, the reward is well worth it, since they can provide improved cards, money, max combo, or even momentum. I mean, there's also healing and max health, but in the case of health, the latter grows at a snail's pace and is largely outstripped by every other option. Though I do have to offer a bit of a critique here, a fairly major one actually, given the nature of the game as a deck builder, and that's the simple fact that you can't preview a card's upgrade, which can make it difficult to discern whether the cards you're being offered in a draft are dead weight or if it might be worth picking up for the sake of upgrading it later. The only way to see this information outside of a gym where you get the option to upgrade your cards is to check the game's card compendium, and if you back out to check the card compendium, you give up the current cards you're being offered, which just sucks. You basically don't get to check them. And upgrading is a serious consideration because deck management is expensive. Whether upgrading or removing cards, the cost scales up dramatically to an almost debilitating degree if you intend on doing more than one, and you're generally fairly starved of money. Anyways, tangent aside, what I'm trying to say here is Fits frequently winds up feeling just as much as a puzzle game as a combat-oriented deck builder, in a manner that reminds me a bit of Into the Breach. It certainly doesn't hurt that the enemies which populate each of the chapters all have fairly distinct quirks to boot, which can make things pretty complicated pretty quick, to the point that dealing with the mini and main boss fights frequently boil down to trying to parse out what's the quickest way to shut down specific problem children. Like so. Fuck fighting this guy normally. In any case, that's the bulk of what a run consists of. I mean, technically, there are event tiles too, but I'm actually a bit iffy on their execution. See, the majority of them simply don't match up to what a fight can give you if you complete its optional objectives, or ask you to gamble on a nebulous prize at a risk of serious injury, money loss, or even taking a run-hampering injury. Really, your best options are when it does something like offer a challenging fight in exchange for a reward, but even then, gambling on the tile still doesn't feel overly worthwhile unless my other options were potatoes, like going to a medic tile when you don't have a permanent injury. So yeah, that meant most of my runs were largely built around me trying to trace out my routes to optimize combo and momentum, though not necessarily defined by that, if only due to the combat styles. See, at the start of every run, you get to choose what Agent 11's focus is, which influences their starting deck as well as passive enhancement, like the Wrestler having extra starting health or Trickster having extra momentum. While these specializations don't necessarily possess any cards that are unique to their position, they provide a very solid and cohesive foundation for a given playstyle, especially given how tricky it can be to build a deck. And they're readily accessible too, given it mostly hinges on you raising your account level by playing the game, which also unlocks new cards to find. I say largely hinges on, by the way, because we've now officially veered into DLC territory and the inclusion of the Gunslinger. Basically, at the start of the new game's opening, we gain access to the power of gun, and it's fascinating, providing players with a relatively stable means of dealing ranged damage and a new stance mechanic which can make maintaining combo initially fairly difficult, since you lose it all when going into the Gunslinger stance from the default draw card. And that's far from the only shift either, because though the Weapon of Choice DLC story sees the player player largely retracing the steps they've taken in the base game, as far as area and enemy order is concerned, there's a rather simple addition that drastically scales up the difficulty of the game, namely the assassin mini-bosses. Every few stages they show up at a fixed point, initially serving as beefy mooks, but gradually acquiring a small library of passive abilities to make your experience a nightmare. Like preventing enemies from harming each other, while also possessing the ability to move whenever you move, thus staying out of your reach so you can't shut them down. In any case, their addition makes certain already challenging enemy compositions absolute nightmare fuel. That said, the biggest change is undoubtedly the new final fight, given it introduces a new chapter and an entirely new final boss to face off against, who will absolutely dismantle you if you give her a chance. So I didn't, and I just kept her permanently stun locked because I'm a cheap weasel and this game rewards that. All of this just to say there's a fair amount to do, and that's without even getting into the subject of the game's randomized daily plays or the difficulty levels. Now, while I haven't touched on this latter subject much, they're more than just quality of life relative to movement abilities. For instance, lower difficulties allow you to replay a turn or few in the instance that you made a grievous mistake while arranging your actions. In fact, the most forgiving one even allows you to redo a fight from scratch. That said, the hardest option is just, it's hellish. Specifically, it causes you to automatically game over if you happen to fail a single optional objective. So if that ambassador got himself killed, game over. Didn't get across the map to collect a briefcase because it's body blocked by a shotgun enemy with knockback, game over. Still, as much as that's a brutal capstone for the gameplay section, I want to move on to the aesthetics because this game just oozes style. In fact, that's a major facet of the whole endeavor, and Fitz is unabashedly aware of it to the point that it gives you the option to replay a fight and watch all of your actions play out uninterrupted, which can be pretty neat, all given. That said, its visual elements aren't just limited to rule of cool, as its UI also includes a fair amount of practical elements. For instance, the ability to rotate the environments isn't just useful for ogling a room, it also gives you a mean of seeing if there's anywhere highlighted, since that translates to a point where you can knock an enemy out of bounds. And speaking of helpful visual elements, it also tags every enemy with a number so you can see the order in which attacks will play out in a turn, which can be very useful for setting up earlier enemies to kill or mess with each other. So on the whole, I quite like fights in tight spaces. While it certainly possesses a bit of a learning curve given how it handles its combat, there was something compelling about the process of mastering its movement system, of figuring out the nuance in controlling an enemy's positioning, how to shut down a troublesome foe, or even weaponize them against their peers. Really, the only thing which detracted from my enjoyment of its combat encounters was the simple fact that the relative linear experience in boss pool meant the earlier segments could feel a bit tedious to run through. That said, the game actually grants you the option of skipping straight past them if you so desire, and also crank the difficulty of the game since you'll be lacking all the upgrades you might have otherwise found. It is an option though if you're looking for a challenge, and even beyond that, the sheer variety in the actual combat styles and the overall cards you can earn still adds a lot of replayability. I mean, I guess if we are really going to nitpick, the event system is a bit of a miss, but honestly, it wasn't enough to change my thoughts on the experience. At the end of the day, I genuinely think that Fights in Tight Spaces is a crit hit. It fulfills a very unique niche insofar as what it is, and if you're a fan of deck builders, I do recommend this title, as the execution of its tactical elements is truly fascinating. Just don't go in for the narrative because it's mostly goofy and just sort of a tacked on excuse plot. There is a sequel on the way in the form of Nights in Tight Spaces, so that's a thing. Anywho, thanks for tuning in. If you have something to say, leave a comment. If you enjoy my efforts to create new indie reviews and interviews, hit subscribe and the bell. For a link to my Discord, the Crit Hit Cauldron, you can check the description, and also check out my Patreon to see reviews early and support the channel, like Greenwich Babby and Andy noted. Also, I have a merch house with neat swag like Crit Hit coffee mugs and shirts. That said, I'll catch you on the next episode of Crit Hit. Take care till then, folks.